News Talk 93.9 and 910 WSBA.
Gee, it's not good to do that with the boss standing here. Anyway, 8:30.
Well, you know the old joke. Whenever I was in the building, the dead air king is here, so look out.
Oh, jeez. 8:35. It is WSBA Morning News with Gary Sutton. And Gary off until Monday. Dave, Eddie, and I holding down the fort. And today, that voice you just heard might sound very familiar. Jim Horn sticking around for the rest of the hour as we try to figure out, a way to say goodbye to Chris Huber. Luckily, it's not incumbent upon us solely, and we just happened to. He was a longtime general manager here at the station, and I think Jim put it best when, really part of the culture here, and so it's not just an employee, not just a boss, but someone who is not only connected to the community, but was part of a larger family that impacted. I think is still doing that today. At least I like to think so. But let's go to Gary. Gary in Dallastown. Now, Gary, remember you're on the air. So you and I had a conversation earlier this week about how you knew Chris and had been to his house and had talked to him. Can you talk a little bit about your experiences with Mr. Huber?
Sure. Well, I kind of came in the back door. I came after Chris retired. His wife is a close friend of my wife and I, and I'm his wife, Lynn's figure skating partner, and also involved in the Special Olympics. And one of the first years that I was involved in it, we got invited over for New Year's Eve, and we went over for a New Year's Eve party, and of course, most figure skaters are women, and everybody's jabbering out in the kitchen. And I go in, and here's Chris Huber sitting in the chair watching football, of course.
Pennsylvania Fats.
I love football.
Yep.
Anyway, I had one time I was thinking about going into radio, and I thought I knew a little bit about it. And anyway, he and I got to talking. I said, well, Chris, what did you do, when you were working before you retired? He said, well, I was a station manager for WSBA. I said, you're kidding. So I thought, oh, yeah, I was going to show my knowledge. So I threw out a name. Oh, yeah, well, I remember when Ed Lincoln was on. Well, Chris would do, like 15 minutes on that Ed Lincoln. And I said, well, and I remember Hal Raymond, and, he'd sit there and he'd express every view that he ever had of, anybody, any name I threw out.
Right.
So, this went on year after year after year, and I'd sit in the living room with him, and eventually everybody else went away, and it was just Lynn and his wife and my wife and my wife. They'd be in the kitchen, and we'd get to talking, and he'd talk constantly about how he'd get around all these business problems and all these amazing things. And so one time I just said, Chris, I said, we've been friends a long time. Do you really miss this? What do you miss about this? He said, Gary, the thing I miss the most is not being able to raise money for the community. Yeah. He said, I raise money for all these different charities, and I'm helpless to do that now. So all these stories that, he's telling, and he loved radio, and he loved you guys.
Yeah.
And but the one thing that he remembered is about really what he really missed was really being able to help people and help the community. And he only ever really got stern with me one time. I knew him for about 15 years, spent a lot of time with him. And in fact, I had a tour of every hospital and every rehab home, I think, in the area when he was sick. Mm. And he'd had a coronary bypass, and my wife and I were sitting alone in the room with Chris. And he said, you ought to take your wife out to dinner tonight. And I said, well, we usually just go out to breakfast. He said, no, you need to take your wife out to dinner tonight. In fact, you need to take your wife out to dinner a lot. And I said, well, yeah, we go out every once in a while. He got really stern with me. He said, no, I'm not kidding, Gary. He says, you really, really, really need to regularly take your wife out to dinner, enjoy your wife, and enjoy your life. Mm. And that's the kind of guy he was.
Yeah.
The kind of guy he was.
That story is very indicative, I think, of our memories of him because, we really can't tell all of those stories because a lot of his stuff he did behind the scenes. A lot of people didn't know. Yeah, when we did, events where we were associated with a group or a nonprofit, obviously, our association was clear. But that was the tip of the iceberg of the things people would call here. I can't tell you how many times they would call and they'd say, well, who's your general manager? And I'm like, well, it's Chris Huber. Oh, I know Chris. I'll call Chris myself.
And some of the ways he maneuvered around, he said one time he was calling on a client up in Harrisburg, and he went through the center square, and this was back in the earlier days, I guess, and they had some sort of a police stand there in Harrisburg, and the police stand didn't have any cover for the sun. And he drove through the square, and he got to thinking, well, I think what we can do here is we can ask if they would like a big umbrella. So he bought them this big, huge beach umbrella.
Wow.
Of course, you put the call letters SBA 910 on it.
Naturally.
And so everybody that drove through, and of course this drove the WHP people absolutely insane. He was right in their backyard. And
but see,
and
the
then,
creativity of that is...
Yeah, the creativity.
Yeah. He was
and then
able...
the mayor calls him in and
Yes.
says, WHP is screaming about this doggone umbrella. So
See, that was
said,
the scoreboard before the scoreboard.
Right.
Oh, no, I know.
Right.
He was the scoreboard. So he goes back in and he takes all the call letters off, and now he's a bigger hero yet because the police said, well, he still donated the doggone umbrella, and he doesn't even have his call letters on, so it worked great.
Gary, I appreciate it so much. Thank you for
thanks,
your
Gary.
call earlier this week and also now. Thanks very much.
Thanks. Hope to see you Saturday.
Yes, hopefully. WSBA News Time. It's 8:41, and good morning. Your first name? Oh, what? I guess we lost him. Sorry about that. I'm still fiddling with this new. We have it's not a new phone system, but you might, if you're a longtime listener, especially recently, you're not hearing the phone ring anymore, and that's because I shut off the ringer, and that's because we got a new light, so that this light blasts. It flashes when someone calls, but I just recently discovered that it only does that for the first phone line. So although I grabbed the first couple, and usually you come in waves, batches, if you will, I get those, but when I turn away sometimes, and I have another phone bank in front of me as well, but I have lots of things to be distracted by. Anyway, at 8:42, I don't know, was there anything there that you heard that jogged anything else?
Well,
Jim?
we probably do 3 hours on the life and times of Chris. The experience that Gary had of sitting in Chris's living room with him sitting in a chair and watching football, I had many times as well after Chris retired from here. And, I just go up to see him and stop in. And
did you ever get any betting advice?
No, and Chris knew pretty early on that I was not a wagerer, and so he never talked too much about that sort of thing to me, nor did he complain about any losses that he might have. But he was one of those guys who he enjoyed doing that kind of thing. He owned racehorses. He and the late Congressman Bill Goodling had a partnership, I believe, where they jointly owned a couple of racehorses. Chris was. I don't know how well known he was at Pimlico, but I know that he went to Pimlico frequently, and if Chris went anywhere frequently, he became well known. I mean, he was just that kind of a guy.
Not incognito.
Yeah, I mean, Chris was under the radar, as you pointed out, in so many different causes and charities in the area, but he was also one of those guys that everyone knew. As Gary mentioned, everyone in the community
he became
knew Chris.
ingrained. What I mean by that is, he didn't want to be ostentatious about it, but he was gregarious nonetheless.
He was gregarious, and he was the kind of person who, when he got involved in something, it was not fractionally involved. He was wholly involved, wholly invested in whatever it was. And so he became known that way. Even if he didn't want to become well known, he became well known just because of the sheer force of his personality.
You're listening to Jim Horn, a longtime voice here at WSBA, and we do have other callers, so we're going to get to you at 1-800-357-0910 as we take some time out, not only getting you up and going this morning with traffic and weather and the news and some other tidbits as well. But also remembering our former general manager here, Chris Huber, a well-known member of the York County community, and you're welcome to share in the time that we have left.
News Talk 93.9 and 910 WSBA.
8:47, and we are remembering Chris Huber in our final minutes here this morning, and we're lucky enough to have Todd Turper, longtime salesman, and I think you were even sort of general manager here too, weren't you, Todd?
Yep, for sure.
Yeah, and here you are. No one probably worked as closely with Chris as you. And you bring up an interesting point that you think that more people will be familiar with Chris because of one of his particular projects.
Absolutely. Probably half the audience can reach in their wallet still and pull out their WSBA radio card. Radio card day at the fair, radio card bingo, all the different events we did, the razzle dazzle, cheap gas. We had discounted gas days. Jim, you remember those days?
Oh, absolutely.
It was wild and crazy, man. It
was interesting.
He was the king of razzle dazzle.
Todd, when we were at the apex of the radio card promotion, which lasted for years and years and years, one of the things that was interesting, at least to me, was that Susquehanna Radio owned stations in San Francisco and Dallas and Houston and Miami and Orlando and goodness knows where. And all of these stations were doing radio card promotions. WSBA had more people carrying radio cards here in York, Pennsylvania, and not as a percentage, we're talking about raw numbers, than the stations in San Francisco and Dallas and Houston and Miami and Orlando. Wow. It was a huge event here.
Saw value in them because Chris, all these events and promotions and contests and things we did, there we had radio card bingo out at the fairgrounds, and 10,000 people were out there playing one game of coverall bingo.
Yeah,
it's crazy. That's the, if anything showcases Chris's ability to engage the community in something, it was the radio card program. It was just celebrity auctions at the Strand Capitol. We gave cars away, on. And just, there's not a nonprofit in this town that wasn't touched by Chris Huber.
Well, the auctions that he had at the Strand Capitol, Todd, if you remember, they were so big that the police had shut down George Street.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. It was.
I remember the Zodiac. You remember the Zodiac? That was an internal
that was
thing
for customers and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, it was still very entertaining. We had Christmas parties where we had all kinds of things, which I'm sure he made you do. But but you guys created magic, and he was at the helm of that.
And to have lived that with him for all those years, it's just such a part of anybody who worked around him, or quite frankly around him in the community, just was touched in such a positive way. And it's, I feel like part of my soul's been ripped out.
Chris's personality.
I haven't had a good cry about this yet, but I think on Saturday at his funeral I'm going to. So.
Well, Chris's personality was such,
inspiring,
Todd, that he wouldn't say the words to you, but if you were associated in any way with either Chris himself or with one of the events that he was involved in, his personality would say to you, "Buckle up, we're going to go for a fun ride here." And that's pretty much the way it always worked out.
Yeah, it was just, it's hard to communicate to the listeners, listening today, but if they remember the radio card or all the contests that occurred at WSBA over the years, there's a good chance that Chris Huber was behind them all, and all the enjoyment people had with that over the years. He was he never took credit for it, but he was the one that kind of was a P.T. Barnum of York.
Todd, I'm not going to let you go on a somber note. I know you well enough that you have probably a million stories. Tell one that will underline his mischievous side.
His mischievous side.
Yeah. Does he have one where because I know you guys. You have plenty of stories. You make it clean.
Well, one day he told me to get in the car. We're going down to see Art Gladfelder, Gladfelder Insurance. And I said, "What are we going down for?" He says, "Well, we're going to do a fundraiser for the York Symphony." I looked at Chris and I said, "York Symphony?" Now, Chris Huber and York Symphony, that's not necessarily my brain. We're going to go together. And I'm like, okay. And so we gone down there, and they started talking. They had a committee they were putting together. And, of course, Chris took it to a whole nother level. They did a Pops concert at the fairground for many, many years. And he brought all the razzle-dazzle to it. And on the way back from this meeting, I said, why did we do that? He said, well, Art wanted it, and I need something from Art as well. I need him to help me out with another charity. It was always something else that he was angling for on the other side. But I'll never forget that ride down over to Art Gladfelder's office.
Well, Todd, thanks so much for calling and giving that perspective. I appreciate that.
Thanks for doing this, guys.
Thanks, Todd.
You bet.
So do I have time here?
Yes.
I don't want to mess up
we
the
have
clock.
45 seconds,
All
or
right,
do you
so
want to
one
save
of the
it
things,
after the break?
Well, one of the things that Todd talked about there was always something else. And that's what I was trying to reference when I said about how Chris taught you how the world really worked. So he wanted to do this fundraiser for the York Symphony to help out Art Gladfelder. But later on, he wanted Art Gladfelder to help him out with something else. And that's one of those ways that the world really works, but that they don't teach you that in school. They don't even teach you that in B school. Right.
But he had the connections and the imagination to be able to think of those things. Yep. We are remembering Chris Huber this morning in our final moments, and it's WSBA Morning News with Gary Sutton. Not only is it a little on the somber side, but it's also Johann Sebastian Bach's birthday today. Normally we play some clips of songs and news events, and it's our main contribution today, other than our local sad news of the passing of our former general manager, Chris Huber, which we mentioned earlier this week, and decided to take some time today. We're lucky enough to have Jim Horn, who is a program director of WSBA for many years and operations manager, and has come back into the building. It's not like the Mafia, though, is it? Like Godfather, too? They keep pulling me back.
It's not the Hotel California either. You can check out, but you can never leave.
True enough. But you were saying in the break that we were looking for the mischievous things. I mean, the story that Todd told is kind of indicative of his imagination, but you had one.
All right, I'll try to make this quick, and I may get some of the details wrong because it was a long time ago.
Okay.
I don't remember when it took place.
So don't write a book.
So your wife, Kelly West, and I were co-hosting a fundraising event. I think it was at the Yorktown Hotel. Now, I don't remember the organization, but every high roller in town was there, and Chris was in charge. And somehow or other, during the course of this fundraising event, where we were auctioning things off and taking bids on this, that, and the other thing, Chris got the bright idea that he would spend some money and add to the charity's money count if he could throw a pie into the face of Bob Pulo, who was at that point the head of York Federal Savings and Loan. Oh. So Pulo goes, okay, whatever it takes to raise money for the charity. So Chris pays the money and throws a pie in Bob Pulo's face. Well, then Bob pays money and throws one back in Chris's face. And pretty soon, Kelly and I are standing there at the dais trying to gain order here at this fundraising event. And all these high rollers in town in expensive suits are paying huge bucks to throw pies in each other's face.
See, and where did that come from? Do you think he had that idea when he went into the thing?
I think it was probably spontaneous. He probably saw a pie and thought, you know what? I would really like to plaster Bob Pulo with this pie.
And how often is it that he knew how to judge whether people would do something like that?
That was one of the gifts that he had. He had an uncanny ability to read.